Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Sarah Haider. Born in Pakistan, Sarah spent her early youth as a practicing Muslim in the United States, leaving religion in her late teens. Since 2013, she has advocated for the acceptance of religious dissent and is the current executive director of Ex-Muslims of North America. Sarah is a former board member of the Reason Rally Coalition and a co-founder and current board member of the Rights and Religious Forum. In addition to free thought, Sarah is particularly passionate about civil liberties and women's rights. She also writes on Substack, Hold That Thought. I welcome Sarah Haider to Savage Minds. All the readings I have done over the past 23 months have left me with a huge question mark as to how Fauci was given this mitre to hold in the US, how Sage was given a mitre in the UK, and so forth and so on. And we're getting information in piecemeal format such that the Omicron, if you recall, 2 months ago, it was the worst thing ever. Now, publications are saying it's not that dangerous. It's highly transmissible, but it's less deadly. Okay, great. Now we've got that piece of information, but what do we do for the last 60 days that they've been spinning the death plague all over? And I tell you, I have serious issues with the media now, because major media, because we're all beholden to it, even minor media. What I do is I'm using CNN to footnote what? When CNN cannot toe the line on masks from 1 month to the next, right? Or when Facebook and Twitter are deleting users who post peer-reviewed studies that show, like the DMAS study, that show that masks are not actually helping in virus mitigation. So you know what I mean, Sarah? This is a really serious issue as to the role of media, the efficacy of media, and how media, big tech, big business, etc., have gotten together to sort of snowball us. And if we dare tweet something wrong, then goodbye Twitter account, right?
Right. I mean, it's so on the one hand, to where I can say that, well, let me stop and take into account the fact that obviously this is an ongoing, evolving situation. We know something for a fact, quote unquote, and in the one day, and then on the other day we learn something new, and that's fine, and that's how science happens, and we expect that our public officials, that they are doing the best that they can, or we hope that they're doing the best they can. It's what you mentioned just towards the end there, which is that it's that combined with this strange campaign against, quote unquote, disinformation that just seems to be extremely foolish at a time when we really don't know what the truth might be, and that when the situation is evolving, and we've seen that right from the beginning of the virus, that we thought we knew what this was, and then we didn't, and then we thought we knew again, and then we didn't, and we're learning. So it makes no sense that in an environment like this, that tech companies are working together with these public health organizations to stamp out, quote unquote, misinformation. I just think I think it's so foolish, and I'm concerned about what it means. And I also think that it will lead to, and it already has led to, greater distrust among the public when it comes to how we feel about our public health organizations, and how willing we are to listen to them. But yeah, I mean, it's an evolving, scary situation.
And there's a lot of paradoxical circumstances within irony as well, when you start to take into account that prior to this pandemic, we were living in times, a lot of my work prior to 2020 revolved around the gender identity movement, where women and men were getting knocks on their door all throughout the UK by the police because they tweeted that sex is immutable. And I find it quite paradoxical, because these same agencies and health authorities and councils that are now arguing, believe the science, get vaccinated, all this stuff, but they're the same groups of people who were saying that we were like Nemo, that we could change sex naturally and magically, and science was sort of on the back burner, and still is with the gender identity movement. And then the way I came to know about you, Sarah, was through your work as being an ex-Muslim. And I was curious about what this meant, of course, because I grew up in a family. My father's Indian, he's Gujarati, Hindi bolta ho. And my learning Hindi came because my family largely are gosh, they hear this, they might kill me, but a lot of them are Modi supporters. And a lot of my family was horrified by the riots in Gujarat. Some hold very anti-Muslim sentiment. I think I can say that honestly without hurting feelings there. And we've had debates. I've had arguments with one of my uncles over this. And then I was in Europe during 9/11, went back to teach at NYU in 2002, and I was alarmed by the anti-Muslim sentiment that I saw in all places, New York City, and of all places amongst some of my dearest friends. It was shocking to me. I was working on a project, Sarah, on Avenue H in Coney Island Avenue, where a large group of men, largely Muslim men, were disappeared by the US government. And it's a project that's been followed by the ACLU, where over 14,000 men with the special registration, if you recall, were disappeared either in reality and or bureaucratically put on night planes back to Egypt, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And this was a reality in 2002, 3, 4. But then I saw somehow things shift as well, where there was a wokery that emerged not because of the disappeared of the Muslims in America, not necessarily because of some kind of guilt by neoliberals in the US about how we reacted to 9/11, but all of this, as you saw with the incident with the Palestinian American activist in Palestine, I forgot her name, Rachel Corrie. It was all on the heels of that where I began to see some kind of pushback from Jewish Americans and leftist Americans more verbally against the state of Israel. And I began to see that there was a political, quote unquote, awakening that was taking form in terms of a rhetoric that I found a bit far stretched and not enough couched in fact, if you catch me. And that's sort of where I'm coming from, because I am a leftist and I saw Islamophobia. At the same time, I saw a lot of doubling back and sort of a type of convenience marker of self-empowerment of the individual through political markers of the international scene, if you catch what I'm saying.
Mm, mm. Yeah. And I, I was a Muslim, so I can't, I like to bring this up because people, when I'm discussing this issue, they conveniently forget that I remember what it was like to be a Muslim in post 9/11 America. I remember what it felt like, and sometimes that feeling is more important than maybe the reality of what persecution might be, because you feel besieged, you feel concerned about your friends and family, and I remember what that was like. But that is, those issues are real, but none of them take away from the fact that the issues with the religion are also very real and impact those very same Muslims. And if anything, impact a much larger group of people, because you have the entire Muslim world. It's a far larger group of people that is impacted by the problems within the religion, as opposed to the relatively small group of people that is in the Western world that may be subject to persecution. Although it doesn't really make sense to compare one hardship with another. I bring it up only because people tell me to shut up because of it. Like people tell me that this is not the time for you to be talking about what's going on within the faith, because look at all that Muslims are suffering in the United States and and the Western world broadly. And then I say, well, I'm not denying that exists, but that's not sufficient reason for me to stop talking about the issues within the faith. And if anything, if we want to just compare what is the bigger harm, I think without a doubt, the bigger harm is a religious ideology that forestalls all kinds of progress. I mean, and truly all kinds of progress, from scientific progress to to approaching a more egalitarian society in terms of gender, to accepting people of different sexual orientations, to just expanding our horizons in terms of art and then that sort of thing. I mean, these societies are just hindered from expanding in this way and becoming a part of the modern world in every sense. And a lot of that can be pulled back to the religious ideology that makes it a crime to go against the religion, and then we see the impact of that.
Indeed. And there's been a lot of debate within the Arabo-Islamic world about democratic rights and religion. I've done a lot of work in the Maghreb. So between Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, since the independence from France, there have been many scholars who have come forward to critique, let's say, the royal family of Morocco, or even Bourguiba's hold on power in Tunisia. And keep in mind that Bourguiba was and is considered one of the most pro-feminist leaders in the Arab world in decades. He, for instance, made laws to make it illegal for dragueurs, who are these men who whistle and taunt girls and women, outside of schools by a certain number of meters. I believe it was 100 meters. And he set up a social and political system at the time in Tunisia, which many women, many feminists said was the most advanced. That was then. He got out of power. We saw what happened with Ben Ali. Many journalists at the time of Ben Ali said they preferred working in Morocco under the reign of Mohammed VI because they had no freedom. So all of what we think in the West, that monarchies are somehow more repressive than elected presidents, was completely inverted. And then go to Algeria and what happened there with the Fis and their civil war. Now the period which seems to be bringing the most interesting results, I'd say, of the region in terms of democratic expression, to what's happened then in Egypt, Iran, and so forth. And we're left with so many cultural and political differences that it becomes almost impossible to speak about Islamo or Arabo-Islamic culture as a group. There is no homogeneous group out there, really. At the same time, as a Pakistani-American, you had your experiences. You were born in Pakistan, and then you were raised in Texas. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious what your thoughts are in terms of how you see yourself, obviously, as a Pakistani-American, but at the same time, is it so possible that we can generalize about the way in which Islam oppresses or liberates the subject, depending on what side of that debate you're on?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a very complicated, topic, and I understand. I mean, what you said, both sides of that topic, or wherever you happen to be on. I mean, I understand where that feeling is coming from, the resistance to make any kind of claim whatsoever, because it is it must be, right. Like if you're making a generalization over such a broad group of people, it is going to be necessarily not true for a large percentage of them. But it is only, I think that so long as we are careful about how we speak about this issue, I think that we must be able to make some broad claims about what the effect of the religion might be. And it's interesting to me because we don't, in other cases, we don't really resist making a claim such as, okay, in a varied environment, this specific variable, whether that be culture, a certain, political history, let's say like a history of having been colonized, or a history of colonialism. Like we wouldn't, when we're analyzing sort of just these broad patterns, we don't say that we simply cannot know what what a country might have experienced having been colonized. Like we simply cannot gather this data because it's a generalization. I mean, if we think in those terms, then really we can't say anything about anything, right? Like we can't say that democracies tend to be like this and monarchies tend to be like that, because technically it's always a generalization and necessarily not true for some percentage of the population. But I think there are ways to analyze the effect of religion as clearly as we can. And of course, it's not perfectly clear because we're talking about human societies that have, 1,000 different pulls and pushes in different directions. And in the case of the Muslim world, a huge variety of cultural backgrounds upon which this religion is variously enforced or just simply absorbed into the population. So South Asian culture, Indian culture is very different than Arab culture, which is very different than Turkish culture and heritage and even political history. But that doesn't mean that we can't find patterns. And in fact, I think that some patterns are pretty clear, and to deny that they exist is in itself extremely problematic. One pattern that I like to point out is the consistent resistance to gender equality in Muslim majority countries, and particularly in countries that have, that aren't necessarily secular, that have a level of religious, you can call it theocratic, but it isn't necessarily that way, but just religious influence on politics, especially in domestic affairs. And whenever you see that women are not equal in the law with men.
Right.
And that's an easy pattern to see, and you can see it over and over again. And you can see that despite differences in culture, despite different experiences with colonialism and other forms of political organization, despite whether they happen to be more authoritarian in their political organization today, or whether they have absorbed democratic elements, you always see this, right? So, and then we can go back and say, why might that be? And I think it's very clear that there are aspects of the religion that and what I've seen this. I read this somewhere. I forget who said this, but this scholar of Islam who looked into specifically domestic violence in the religion and whether or not it approved of it or not. She said that Islam is necessarily a gendered religion, and I agree with her in the sense that to be a good Muslim, if you are a man, there's certain ways you have to move about in the world to be a good Muslim, and if you're a woman, there are different duties and obligations that you must take upon yourself in order to reach heaven. And even heaven looks different for men and for women. So this is a gendered religion. Of course, it will have an effect on the population that either believes in it or is forced to abide by its restrictions.
Well, Fatima Mernissi looks at this, in fact, in much of her work, and she's gone through many of the hadith that specifically target women or sexist symbolism of women. And she looks at the hadith by Abu Bakr, one of the Prophet's companions, who was a renowned wife beater, and she questions what is called the isnad in Arabic, the chain of veritability of the hadith itself. And as you probably know, Islam is very scientific, quote unquote, in how these hadith are recorded and verified. Yet, she says, despite all of these verifications, it wasn't really taken into account that Abu Bakr was a renowned wife beater. So why is anything that he says being taken worth more than a grain of salt? That's part of the thesis of one of her books on this very subject. What has impressed me over the past decade is, especially in groups, I'm in a lot of groups over women's rights, is when any woman critiques Islam and that woman happens to be not Muslim or happens to be white, she will be beaten down by the wrath of words of other women calling her a racist without listening to what she is saying. And this has come about in the age of wokery, where now you can only speak if you have any of these tick box characteristics, such as, are you a sexual minority? Are you a woman? Are you a person of color? Et cetera, et cetera. Where I think that we ought to be tabling the debate upon facts rather than sentiment, rather than who you are or identify as. And this is a problem. I'm sure you've had this problem, and you are coming from a background of being raised as a Muslim. And I read that your father also stepped away from the religion. So you might even be seen by some as some kind of contagion, you see, where you could be framed as someone who's very toxic to the religion, toxic to stability, in the way that in Islam, the word fitna was used to refer to the Prophet's last wife, Aisha, when she went into battle. That battle of hers was called fitna rather than the battle of Aisha. It was also called the Battle of the Camel, where she went up against the caliphate to decide. Well, basically, it was a split between Sunniism and Shiitism. Now, I find this all very fascinating because we see from the very beginning of the writings of the history of Islam that women were written out of the history or written to minimalize their participation in that history, even though their participation in that history, to include the Prophet Muhammad's life, was very important, right? I mean, his first wife. I mean, and so Fatima Mernis's work, I'm a big fan of her work because she starts to examine the role of his wives in one of her other books, looking at how this was a man who was formed by women, not the inverse, right? And it's interesting that today, the way that Islam is interpreted, not just within the religion, but outside, is, well, many in the West, and I think your sentiments about this, from what I have read of yours, is that it's a very troubling religion in terms of gender disparity. What women's rights are not acceded, whereas men are given all the rights. On the other hand, of course, during the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, in 13th centuries, when Europe was at war with itself, you had this renaissance happening in North Africa and Grenada, where women were building mosques, right? So in a way, I look at some of the disempowerment of women not as necessarily part and parcel only of, let's say, the religion itself, but also of the way that time and invariably throughout all cultures treats women. I'm not sure if you're aware that in India, there's a lot of Hindu women who convert to Islam because they actually see that religion as more empowering for them than their own. And why is that? Well, Islam at least concedes women a certain right of inheritance, right? Or you skip over to Lebanon, where I know men who have converted from Sunniism to Shiitism because their daughters will get more of an inheritance, right? So there's all of these technical tissues underneath the surface that play a part in how people see their own role within this religion. Or I read, maybe you can correct me, but I read about 2 years ago that there was a conference in Tunisia where scholars were rethinking to reinterpret the religion through perhaps a new set of texts. But I don't know what happened with that because lockdown.
No, I didn't hear about that. Well, I mean, there've always been attempts to reinterpret the religion to be something more progressive, more egalitarian, more fair to women. And I'm obviously on the side of those. Like I support people who are trying to find gender equality through the faith, and I see the usefulness of that. In that there are some Muslims who will only accept gender equality if they can be convinced that the religion, in fact, the true, authentic practice is more egalitarian, and that they will not listen to secular arguments. So that might be true. So I hesitate to ever say 100. I feel 100% certain that the only way to gender equality is through this secular ideological, like, persuasion tactics. But having said that, I am frustrated with that I have to say that that in the past there are some cultures that have existed in the past, or there are even some cultures today, as you mentioned, where women are treated, in fact, a little bit worse. And so Islam is better than them, and therefore it doesn't have to be this misogynist religion. Or bringing up Muhammad's wives. I mean, as you brought up Khadija, I think Khadija is a very interesting example in that she was Muhammad's first wife. She was the most empowered of his wives. She was a businesswoman. She was a powerful person. She employed Muhammad. She was older than him. She was definitely somebody who had a huge influence on him. He didn't take any other wives until she died. So this is an incredible woman, but this is also a woman that existed and operated prior to Islam, right? Islam didn't exist as a religion until after they were married. She was already this powerful person, and indeed there are so many ways in which prior to the founding of Islam, prior to the full revelation coming out, women were no longer had the kinds of freedoms to be the kind of woman Khadija was. To have the kind of autonomy she had. Arguably, Muhammad's future wives didn't have that same autonomy.
Many of the criticisms one could make from 632 onward could be made about many religions at the time. My own grandmother, she was married when she was 12 years old, I believe, 12 or 13. And this was allowed in the 20th century in India. Mm-hmm. So one must wonder to what degree we are perhaps extrapolating by historical commonalities that were consistent within all religions and cultures, or most religions and cultures, let's say, as opposed to, well, your direct criticism of Islam comes from your own experiences and your own readings of the texts. So maybe we can step there for a moment to see what your specific disagreements are, because you mentioned the word misogyny before, and that's a word that I've heard from many women and men in referring to Islam. What are some of the finer points of a misogyny for you within that religion?
So let me backtrack a little bit. I think that what you brought up is, just to clarify, to your audience, I am not, and nor have I ever felt that Islam is the sole or unique, oppressor of women, or this is an ideology that is, that is misogynist and without which there would be no misogyny in that part of the world. I don't believe that, right? Of course, that's not true. And I think what you pointed out about, there are certain certain sort of historical evolution when it comes to women's rights that has been kind of a global experience, and that's something that's really it's a path that many different cultures are on, and they're on various places of that path. What I'm looking at is this religion something that today is a break forward? Is this something that is preventing us from egalitarianism, or is it allowing us to move further down that path? And I think the clear answer is that religion presents a break. Religion represents, it's a block to getting closer to that egalitarianism. And in Pakistan, there are so many examples of how this has come to be. Namely, I mean, I can point to one, which is that a couple of years ago, now it's been so long, and my sense of time with COVID has just it's so warped. But Pakistan only recently got to a point where it began to consider domestic violence in a marriage a crime. It's a very modern taboo in Pakistan, and in fact within the populace is not really much of a taboo. And when it came time for the lawmakers to consider a statute that would criminalize wife beating, it was religious groups and organizations and famous imams that stepped up and said, no, this is un-Islamic. That in Islam, a husband has the authority to discipline his wife. And that authority is given to him in the Quran, not the Hadith, not something that is where we can sort of argue about its relevance to the faith, but in the Quran itself. And so, when I look at that, I think, well, I see what the role of religion is here, and of course, not for every single person, but what is majority of the time its role in this debate, and that's I think the clear answer is that its role is often to limit women in their freedoms in this world, right? To restrict their rights. I mean, you mentioned inheritance. That's a very interesting question, in that in the modern world, women should be, daughters should be allowed to have equal inheritance. And you're right that there are some traditions still that are not Muslim, but also have limited women's ability to inherit. But come on, like, I mean, in the modern world today, we should be able to say that daughters should get equal rights. Islam, that may be better than other traditions, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, that's no longer relevant, and I get frustrated, I guess, with this conversation which always tries to find the best parts of the faith, and there are plenty of people that are doing that. There are, a billion Muslims who are saying that no, this faith is, who are apologizing for this faith in various ways. I don't want to say that everything about the religion is terrible. I don't think that's true. In fact, I think there are a lot of interesting things about the religion that I still find some beauty in. But in some cases, it's very clear that this is a tradition that we need to be able to say that you can be Muslim, you can believe in Islam, but in such and such realms, it cannot be the basis upon which we make our laws. It cannot be the basis upon which we, allow certain kind of even social, norms to develop. And that conversation is very difficult in Muslim majority countries, especially where there just isn't this norm of separating the law with what they believe to be the religious truth.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. It's one of those circumstances that you don't want to ask why the plane is crashing to the ground. You just don't want to be on the plane, I guess. When we start to look across the planet, and I've done this myself, I wonder, are there any religions where women are not oppressed? Because a lot of Buddhists make this claim, but go to Myanmar and look what Myanmar is doing to Muslims. And I don't want to do oppression Olympics between religions, but I think it's fair to say that women have never gotten a good deal in religion. One surprise I had was when I was in Bali to learn that women could be Hindu priests there. I was like, yay. And these ceremonies are largely with flowers. So of course that was a huge yay, but the role of women has never been granted benevolence, not within religion and not without. So part of me wonders if just our role in the world has always been to sort of get the short end of the stick, politically, somatically, in terms of who's doing what kinds of production of work within the house and outside. We see this. One of the first culture shocks I had in India, and I had lived already around the planet, but I had never in my life seen women hoist hundreds of kilos of bricks on their head. Like that was something that was really shocking. And you'd see these men in these small sort of mini caterpillar diggers, and they'd be telling the women where to go with these bricks on their head. And I thought, this is weird, because were I in Guatemala or in Mexico or in Peru, these men would have been hauling the bricks. The women would not have had a caterpillar to sit in, but the men would have been doing the heavy labor. And I noticed in South Asia how much heavy labor women were forced to do, while men were commanding chai coming back and forth to them, And I'm speaking outside of the religion, I'm just talking socially. But within the religion and within Islam as well, I did notice, of course, what are the prohibitions that we cannot do? As soon as I had to, prepare for the Muslim world, I was like, okay, we can wear gold. Yay. I hate gold. So that wasn't a plus for me. Having to cover our arms where men did not. The head covering, it does differ from country to country, because I'm sure you've seen in India, Muslim women tend not to have to cover their arms, and many do not cover their heads. There are other forms of covering that happen, but not necessarily in the same way as a hijab or any other type of veiling. And I wondered a lot about what the political correlation was to the religious, because again, go to Rabat, and the minute you get near a part of town there called Agdal, which is very posh, all of a sudden you'll stop hearing so much Arabic and it'll start to be largely French, and people will pretend to not understand Arabic. I kid you not. So they pretend that they're French, they pretend they don't understand Arabic, and people will dress more Western. They will often, even in the taxis, you'll be in a taxi any given night, two women jump in because there's collective taxis. They're in full jalaba. But during the taxi ride that might take 20 minutes, they will have taken off their jalaba, underneath which are mini skirts. They put on their makeup. It's like that scene out of Battle of Algiers, it's really crazy, where they are suddenly turning themselves into what they desire themselves to be for that evening. And their parents, of course, likely do not know. So I saw these scenes many times living in the Muslim world. And is it that different than the Catholic girls in Mexico who told their families, I'm going to Stephanie's house or Stefania's house, and they're really going on a date with their boyfriend? So the prohibitions for women's freedom, are they so different? Yes, they're tightly encoded in Islam, where in Catholicism, it would be argued, I'd say, that the codes were more set out within Catholic schools, within Reform schools. But did girls have any more freedom under Catholicism than girls under Islam? And I wonder about this, how much of this is about holding women and girls as the repository of cultural wealth, cultural significance. Um, Another example I'll give you, I'll throw out, whenever I go to see my family in India, it's usually around what they call NRI season, non-resident Indian season. There's a plethora of weddings. And in the weddings, as I'm sure you know, because similar in Pakistan, you have many days of weddings. And in many of these lighter events, the pre-wedding events, you'll find men showing up in kurta, but they will not be wearing the formal trousers that our fathers and grandfathers wore. They will often be wearing jeans. So they're wearing jeans with the kurta, and the women are showing up in full sari. And every time I notice this for so many events where the men can show up, even sometimes in sandals and jeans and a t-shirt, but the women have to be dressed. And it's made me think a lot the way in which women are and girls are expected to continue the cultural traditions while men are allowed to be lax. Even men are in my family, some of them have had meat. So there's this whole, they get that extra rope to play with. Women rarely do, depending on class. Going back to Agdel in Rabat, Morocco, the more money you have, the more freedoms you have. So I do wonder to what degree some of the criticisms you have of the religion itself might also be class-based, because are there so many people who are strict adherents to the religion who don't have extra rope to play with in terms of their freedom because of wealth?
Right. So, well, I mean, I wouldn't deny that so many other variables, including class, but maybe education, maybe how close they are, how close they live, geographically to differing, perspectives and faiths. I mean, all these variables have an effect on how powerfully religion restricts women, or Islam specifically restricts women. But it only pulls in one direction is my, that's my point. It isn't that it's the case that it's the only pull. It isn't the case that it can never be overcome. It isn't the case that other variables don't impact how powerfully Islam does or doesn't restrict women, but that it does, but that it pulls in one direction and it doesn't pull. I mean, you showed some examples of historically, however, or in very specific cultural circumstances where in fact Islam might be granting people more freedoms, but those are extremely rare. And what we've seen even from the days of Muhammad to now, that in many cases Islam pulls in one direction. In fact, I would argue that almost always pulls in one direction. It's just what differs is the degree to which it pulls in that direction. And when it comes to hijab, for example, right? I mean, you were correct that in a Pakistani or South Asian context, what modesty means is very different than what it might mean in Saudi Arabia, which is very different than what it might mean in Istanbul, which is very different than what it might mean even in the countryside of Turkey, right? Because Istanbul is it's a different world than if you were just to go a couple miles to in any direction. But even having said that, there is a fundamental logic behind the hijab. So whether or not what a woman is required to do is just cover her head, or if she's only required to cover, her bosoms, or in a specific cultural context, it might be, it might be interpreted differently, but the justification is the same. And it's a justification that I have a problem with, which is that the woman's modesty has a relationship, her body and how she holds herself and whether she covers herself or doesn't, or to what degree, has a relationship with her character, with her goodness, with her value as a human. And it's that fundamental logic that I have a problem with, regardless of what the specifics of the hijab might be. It's that it is a requirement at all, and that it is a special requirement on women. I mean, men also have religious restrictions, but it is, I think, what you pointed out, that they are enforced on women far more, maybe just far more effectively, right? Maybe it is the case that women are just more likely to pay attention to these restrictions, but in the case of Islam, I'd say that they're also more strictly policed. I grant you of the etymology of the word aurat, the Urdu word aurat.
Yes, if you could explain this for our listeners, however.
Right. So the word for woman in Urdu is aurat, aurat. And it's very interesting because but by interesting I mean tragic. The word comes from the Arabic word aura. I'm not pronouncing that right. I'm not very good at Arabic pronunciation, but it's the Arabic word for private part. So when you cover you're told to cover your private parts, your aura. And it's interesting to me that in Urdu, that is where we get this word for woman as a whole, is just this private part, just this thing to be covered, this thing to be ashamed of, fundamentally. So I think that there are so many interesting, deep ways that of course a lot of different things, but I think particularly religion affect the way we still think about the place of women, of their bodies, in relation to how they move about the world, in relation to how they should be considered in terms of moral righteousness. And I think you bring up this point several times, and I do agree. I'm not denying that there's something. It seems like misogyny is something that human beings will always have trouble with. And some of that might just be based on who we are fundamentally, or just something about the way that we organize our societies, that we see this pattern again and again, and we see it in so many different cultures, and we've seen it throughout history. And we don't see the reverse, right? We don't see matriarchies popping up all over the place. We don't see them with at best we get egalitarian societies, but humans have this problem with women's rights. So I think about, if it is the case that there is something inherent about women and men as biological creatures that makes us more likely to fall into this one kind of social organization, what can we do as as human beings who want to live in a more egalitarian society, who see the value in every individual of being allowed to be as free as possible, to achieve their potential as much as possible? How can we set up our obviously our legal rules and laws, but also how can we set up social institutions that push back a little bit on this human tendency? And I think in the West we've gotten fairly good. Of course, there's still a lot of disparities, and I think we'll continue to see that for some time. But I don't think it's arguable by serious people to say that in the West women are far more free to live the lives that they want to live, safe from violence, and especially, of course, safe from state sanction. And so we're getting there, right? Like we've managed to come this far. So how can we go further? And what has the West done right that can be replicated in other societies, given the fact that those other societies are indeed different in their political or social orientations.
Well, I agree with you with a caveat, though, Sarah. This is something that I've had to battle myself. I would love to believe that in the West we have all these freedoms that women don't have elsewhere. And there are many freedoms that certainly, undeniably, we have that women don't have elsewhere. There's one freedom, however, that we don't have that women have elsewhere. And this is it. If you followed what's happened over the past 9 years, especially this past summer's Y Spot incident, when women say that men are not women, we get shat upon in the West. In fact, there have been women who've lost grants for research, professors who've been threatened with being fired from universities. I had some of them on the show already. There have been women who've received police visits. I've interviewed several just for saying that sex is immutable. Now, I'm not pretending that the Ayatollah of Iran was progressing gender ideology in terms of our best interests. What the transgender movement has done single-handedly, and they do this all the time, they point to the latest minister of parliament who happens to be a man who identifies as a woman in Pakistan, saying, see, women's rights. And we're all these feminists on Facebook pages, we're in groups rolling our eyes back in our head. We know that the mullahs did not have it in their mind that men become women, hence women's rights are there. That's not the way women's rights are happening. And what's happening in the West is that women cannot say that men are not women. If you say that, you're going to go definitely into Facebook and Twitter jail. Many people have lost their accounts for this, and you will lose your jobs. There are many women who faced what's happened in the UK with professors losing their jobs, having to have bodyguards. There have been so many cases of this. I've actually lost count. Women are not free, and men too. I mean, Grant Linehan, who's a very well-known writer of BBC comedy, is now untouchable because he's come to have our backs and say, this is madness. Men are not women. So we cannot actually say that men are not women. So despite the fact that I can walk down the street with a pretty good certainty that I'm not going to be sexually assaulted or beaten, at the same time, I can't go to San Francisco and say, you're a man without getting myself into a deep load of trouble. You know what I mean?
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about what's going on with the gender ideology. I'll push back again on what I think you're broadly correct in that this is the one way in which women's rights are being restricted in the West that they are not being restricted in the East. Of course, broadly speaking, I would still, 100 times rather be a woman in the West than a woman in Iran, in Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia. But it is true that there's something going on with gender ideology that is that is making it so that we cannot speak about material reality. And when we cannot speak about material reality, we cannot talk about material injustices, right? We cannot talk about the ways in which that material reality reflects onto our social reality, and then how we should deal with it as a society. So there's something about this sort of derangement involving this gender ideology that I think has the potential to undo some of the gains of feminists in the West, and indeed already have in some cases. I think we're at the beginning of something, which is to say that this movement is taking off. It is being enforced in various institutions, but it's just the beginning of that enforcement. So we're not going to see the true effects of that for some time. But that is not to say that we can't already know what those effects will be. Which is to say, like, if you allow biological males into women's spaces, private spaces, and you also say, at the same time, that all that the biological male has to do to be allowed into those women's spaces is to say that they identify as a woman, and that is the sole criteria, women will necessarily be put in danger. And even if they're not in terrible danger all the time, the fact that there's this opening, that there is this, how many? I often get this pushback on Twitter when I point this out, that women's spaces need to be protected from biological males. A lot of people push back and say, usually men, of course, and then push back and say that how many trans women are are transitioning just to rape women. I mean, they just don't believe that that's happening. And I would say I agree. I don't think that trans women are transitioning to rape women. I'm saying that this is a hole that you're creating in the law, this loophole that can and will be abused by anyone, because there is, this ideology has no coherent explanation for what transition even is, why one must take this on, rather than just maybe go to therapy to talk to, find other ways to deal with gender dysphoria, why this has to be this physical thing, and fundamentally what it means to identify as a woman. And I haven't yet received an answer to that question, and I think it's very troubling that this is the core, this is the fundamental question that must have a coherent answer. What is a woman and what is a man? And if they can't answer this, then I am dubious. I look at this entire framework with a lot of I think you can just say hesitancy, but really fear to some degree, because I don't know where it's going to lead, because I don't know what it's saying.
Right. Well, it's all very incoherent, I believe, on purpose. It's very clear that when Switzerland and I believe Scotland had to stop amputating people's limbs because they had clients who flew there to say, I feel like this part of my arm should not be there. And medical boards decided that was unethical. But somehow inculcating teens, young 20-somethings, into a culture of amputating parts of their body, taking artificial hormones that are quite destructive to their bodies and that will limit their lives. This has not been squashed, and it is concerning to me in the same way that, again, this is the anti-science nature of the era, where we're getting advice on COVID from the same people that say that sex isn't real. Well, excuse me, or as I say, excuse me, don't blame people for not listening to your mask mandates and your vaccine advice because you think that we're Nemo. This is absurd. Going back now, Sarah, to my earlier question about how much of this is religious, really, because the criticisms of Islam we could make about a lot of religions, even not necessarily at the same time. But I went to school with twins when I was in elementary and middle school who were Pentecost. And they had to dress in a certain way, not wear makeup, and do things that made them look sort of like they stuck out, the way they adhered to the religion. And someone might make the argument, oh, they were made to be uncomfortable in a city as Catholic as New Orleans. But to what degree are these socio-political constructs, and to what degree are these constructs made to ultimately and unfortunately protect girls? And I'm thinking back to when we first heard about the Taliban and the way that the burqa was implemented. It was because they were protecting, quote unquote, their women and girls from the atrocities of even worse groups than they, and so forth. Not defending it, of course. I'm just saying that I'm thinking back to what a friend of mine said, Mediha, who's a friend of mine from Saudi Arabia, who said to me, we do to women what you do to women, but in the inverse way. We force women to cover up, and your culture forces women to reveal themselves. And I've thought about that over the years, and I can't disagree with her. I think that it's two different sides of the same coin, where women's and girls' lives and bodies are rendered this kind of litmus test for virility, power, wealth, strength, and women pay the price. But no one is really asking why. Now, I agree that there are problems within not just Islam. I think religions pose women great harm. At the same time, when I was in one of these women's groups over the gender identity issue, one of the women came out and said, well, I have real problems with the way that Muslims are handled in our country. She was British. And she referred to the incidents of the grooming gangs in Rotherham and the way in which purposefully the police were made not to investigate initially the fact that the perpetrators of these rapes were largely, and I believe uniquely, South Asian men. And the reason for that is because there was pressure to not look racist on behalf of the police force. And she said, that is racist in itself. Now, this woman was called racist in the group I was in. It was really horrible what happened to her, I have to say, because I'm someone who's been very sensitive about Islamophobia in my own work as a scholar. But what she was saying was not Islamophobic. It was a truism. She was stating that the perpetrators of the Rotherham grooming gangs were Muslim. And why wasn't that investigated? And instead of people looking at that accurately, she was called an Islamophobe. So what is left is that we're left with a room where no one can speak unless they happen to be Muslim. And who's going to talk about that in a void? Part of the point of social media was to get people from various backgrounds talking about various issues. So the South Yorkshire police was guilty of sort of trying to be woke by not looking at the race. And now what's happened is that the force at the center of the Rotherham grooming scandal from years back is now no longer recording the ethnicity of child sexual abuse suspects. This is the latest news that came out a month ago. So where you have wokeism, this is how I contacted you over some of the posts and social media statements you made over wokery, is that wokeism has taken such a foothold in our society today that now the police, not just Joe Schmo on the street, but the police are being woke. And by doing things like not recording data, necessary data, like knowing that a man is in the women's locker room and he's a man because he has a penis, not because he says he's a woman, these are causing serious social and cultural issues. How is it that we can get out of this quagmire that largely the left has constructed? And I'm part of this left, by the way. How is it that we got in this mess? But worse, how do we get out? Because now we're living in an era where if you want to go to a spa, as these women in Los Angeles found out last summer, you can't. Because you go to the spa and you're going to find a man with a penis and then later find out he was a sexual predator.
Right. And well, I mean, so, and again, I think that some of these problems that we're seeing with gender, I mean, specifically, there's the inherent, what is a woman and what is a man that we have yet to ascertain. But the fact that even that we don't know the foundations of this ideology, we don't know the specifics of it, we don't know, why someone believes the way, and we're not allowed to, as a society, have a say in whether we believe this, believe what they believe about themselves, and whether we believe that it should have a say in how we conduct ourselves as a society. That it definitely feels like I feel coerced, right? I mean, I don't feel like this is not a democratic thing where the population is allowed to have a vote in whether or not biological males should be allowed into female spaces. I think that if you did that, I think if you polled, the American public or the British public or any public really in any country, if you polled the vast majority of people, I think it's clear that they will say that no, spaces should be sex segregated. But it's interesting to me that this is not a discussion that we can have in the public space, that there are restrictions being posed. And I think that that's what's very troubling. And if we are to move forward, if we are to move out of this, we must be allowed to at least speak about this issue and have honest conversations with all the parties that are affected. And indeed, we are all affected by gender ideology. Like anyone who has a gender, anyone who has a sex, has skin in the game, has a stake, and should be allowed to talk about this issue and to construct together, as a society, what it means to be trans, what it means to have a different gender. I think it's interesting that only people who are allowed to know, who are allowed to say what a woman is, biological males who are identifying as women. They know what women is, but cis women aren't allowed to have that same kind of seriousness, and that same kind of certainty.
The fact is, cis is the most offensive term I've heard in my lifetime. I'll be honest with you. It's actually saying that you and I identify with all these stereotypes that we've pushed back against. It's the very basis upon which the Taliban was putting women in burqas, was raping men into submission and so forth. Well, they claim it was the Northern Alliance, but there's evidence that they both did this. And the whole idea that there is even an internal intrinsic gender, something that feminists have been pushing back on for decades. Because what would have me identify as cis is what allows these men to say that I belong in a certain space. Now that's back to what we're talking about, where Islam enters stage left to tell women what our true role is. All cis is a role. So I have to wonder if the critiques that you have, and in your critiques of Islam are cogent, if they're not part and parcel of a larger problem of general misogyny that is not necessarily specific to any one religion or world order. It seems to me, to quote Sweeney Todd, the history of the world, my sweet, is who gets eaten and who gets to eat.
Right. Well, I think this, and you mentioned, that was an interesting point about Muslim societies being where women are forced to cover, and then in Western societies where women are forced to uncover. I mean that's I think up until this specific debate, that is kind of I mean, it's definitely something that's like too cute, and I wouldn't say that it's fair to say that there's an equal amount of pressure on women to unclothe as in the West as there is in the East to cover. But I think the main issue which you're getting to is that of autonomy and that of consent. So do I have the right to uncover? Or do I have the right to cover when I see it fit? Do I have the right to consent to specific restrictions? Do I have the right over my own body? And what you were pointing out with the We Spot incident, and all these incidents where women are forced to be in their private spaces, we're forced to expose ourselves in a way that we are not comfortable, in a way that we do not consent, and that is I think that is going back to that reality that here's just another way to take away women's autonomy, to take away women's control over their own bodies. But it is, as you point out, an inverted an inverted kind of misogyny, but it's certainly there. And I think what you were pointing out with the Rotherham, with the rape gangs, I mean, I was very disturbed when I first heard about those, and honestly very depressed, because here is a case where so many young girls are being exploited, are being groomed, or being raped, or being sold, and we as a society are stuttering rather than getting right to the point of what's going on and to solve this issue immediately. And instead, it's getting held up by this form of wokeness, of political correctness. And I think it goes back to this idea that what matters isn't, like in our society, what matters isn't the injustice itself or the harm itself. What matters more is who is perpetuating it. So there are people in our society, groups of people who we have decided, by we, I mean really just this elite group of people who have decided that this is an acceptable villain. And when they are the perpetrators, we will take the injustice seriously. So if it is a white, quote unquote, cisgendered male, and they are committing, assault or abuse against women, and we will take that seriously. We will take that very seriously. But when that perpetrator becomes, any other race, when they start identifying as, not male, then well, then at that point we start hedging, and we start trying to change it. We start to change the conversation towards other things. We start trying to erase even statistics that are relevant. And what you said, with that they no longer, there are movements to no longer record ethnic backgrounds of perpetrators. I've heard that there are similar movements when it comes to gender or biological sex. I know that in order to move forward, in order to be able to move past this, we have to, at the very least, have the ability to speak about it. And this is where the restrictions and of technological, I mean, whether we like it or not, the public sphere is Twitter, the public sphere is Facebook. This is where we come together and we have our conversations. And this is where we as a society, whether we like it or not, and whatever that means about our discourse, this is where it's happening. And it worries me that these there's just a small group of people who have such a powerful effect on what we are allowed to talk about and what we are not allowed to talk about. So that makes me very nervous.
It's a really crazy time because we're facing these kinds of oppressions against women, and we're called all sorts of things. I'm sure you've seen it. We're front holers, cervix havers, users havers, menstruators, vile names to refer to us that make me think that the Taliban was one step ahead. And at the same point, we're not allowed to discuss ourselves without calling ourselves cis. What the hell? I don't identify with femininity. I don't identify with any of it. Now, I might be feminine, but I don't have to identify with something to be it or to enact it or to perform it. Yet we're given Drag Queen Story Hour with, it's really insane because I'm coming from the gay side of the aisle, and all of the stuff that I wanted for my gay rights, great. So many things have come true, but I'm thinking the anvil has swung far the other way. What's going on? This is not what I've signed up for. Like, this is sort of frightening. So we're given this kind of rainbow collectivity of freedom when a lot of it seems to be backdooring abuses to women and children. Now we're finding out how many of the Storytime drag queen artists have secret histories that are rather unsavory, and we would not want our children around them. And I'm not a social conservative, by the way, but we have to also understand that facts mean something, right? So we're there, and then we've got all this pressure on our freedom to speak. Now we're not supposed to speak, Sarah. If you speak, then you're an Islamophobe, you're a racist, you're a misandrist. Have you heard that come up a lot? You are a man-hater.
Julie, no matter you clarified throughout this podcast that you're on the left, that you're progressive, that you've been supporting of so many of these social movements for so long, and that you might notice that I don't do that anymore. I used to do that. I used to do that, but I don't do that, and it's for two reasons. One is that I don't believe it works. I don't think you can say that you can clear your throat all day, and you can talk about how progressive you are or progressive you have been, or like where it is that you're coming from, and it won't change a thing. And if anything, it's going to be held against you, because then it's the dynamics of apostasy that then come into play, which is that you start being punished more for being, a leftist that's step out of line, then you're just, some centrist or some, even mildly right-wing figure that you'll just get dismissed a little bit easier. You're actually going to get treated a little bit more gently than if you say that you're progressive. So there's that practical element of it, that it just doesn't work. It doesn't matter. But there's a second element which I haven't been that public about, but it's I if I'm going to be honest, and I pride myself in being honest about how I feel about certain things. If progressivism today, not progressivism 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, but what it means today, if especially socially, is all these movements that are putting identity, and whether that be racial identity or sexual identity or gender identity, like first and foremost, if these social movements are coming together in this form, then I can't say that I support it, because I don't think that this is good for women, and I don't think this is good for men, and I don't think that this is good for a whole host of minorities that have been oppressed for so long. I don't think they're going to be any less oppressed if we start deranging ourselves, and if we start becoming censors, and restricting these conversations. So I don't, and I don't know where I've landed, right? I'm not saying, I find it very annoying and frustrating when I see, on Twitter or on social media, there's so many people that say, I've left the left, the left used to be blah, 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 but now it's not this way. And so I've walked away, and it feels very performative to me. So I get a little bit frustrated. And then there's also the fact that, these social movements are just one part of what progressivism is as a political movement. There's a lot of other things that are important. I mean, for me, climate change is extremely important. I don't really talk about it publicly because I don't really have anything to say, other than the fact that I, believe that this is something we need to do something about. And, so there are a lot of other issues that matter, and that have an effect on how I feel politically and how I orient myself politically. But when it comes to the articulation of social dynamics that the left has now come to adopt, I have to say I'm not on board, and I'm not on board because I think this is harmful. I think this is going to hurt a lot of people. And I cannot support, especially it's going to hurt women, right? I've always cared about women's rights. I still care about women's rights. And it matters to me whether the specific obsessions and focuses on the political left are helpful to women. And, I have to conclude that they're not. And that is not to say that conservatives are wonderful, but and of course they're not, and of course they have their own problems and blah blah blah, all that throat clearing. I'm just not going to get into it because again, it doesn't matter.